what I will do today is only a snippet of what we know about board games. It is really concentrating on what we now call the Ludic Lexicon as of today, I think. So we have language that comes together with board games. And it does so in multiple ways, and I will take you through a number of different things that we have discovered over the years. And I will mostly talk about my own studies in there. So when you have questions, you can actually ask detailed questions, because I will have some first experiences of it myself. So I gave a little overview here of case studies. They've also all been published in some way of form. And as you can see, it is all over the world. So we have Africa, I'm basically an Africanist, but there's also some South Asian examples, as well as the Pacific. And on the right, you see that it concerns three types of games that I will talk about. Checker games that you may be familiar with, checker or dam or drafts. Mancala games, that we will see multiple examples of that, rows of holes and counters, and card games. Now, you should know, I organized this colloquium on board games. We don't talk to card games people. They have their own symposium. They have their own journal. That's a big divide. These are separate entities. Lottery games, it's a different group of people. They have their own conferences. We don't necessarily talk to these people. So it has been only recently that card games people and board games people started to talk to each other. And it has taken some effort. And the reason is actually quite obvious, because they are in different fields of study. So in card games, people are usually art historians, because they look at paper. They go to museums where there are collections of cards. It's a paper-oriented, it's an art historical-oriented field. While in board games, we look at physical wooden objects, things dug in the sand, where art historians have fairly little to contribute in comparison. So I will merge the two. I've done some research. I still remember the first time I tried to write an article on card games, which was hard. Everything I had to learn of how you talk about a card game. So I will also try to teach you a little bit about how do we talk about card games and what have card games to contribute to this field of linguistics, language, and the Ludic lexicon. So let me just start with a little, I would say, introduction of what we are doing. So words, language, letters, you mentioned script, so script comes into play as well, text, are part of multiple parts of a game. And I will concentrate on one part of it, but I want you to know that there are multiple things that we can actually look at, and that this is just one sliver of the story. So for instance, we have cards, as I told you, and there are very often letters on cards. That is language and games right there. And I don't know if there are any Swiss people here, but Swiss people actually write entire words on cards. There are some German people who do this too. It's very rare, but it happens. So we actually have text even on card games to identify mostly the court cards, as we call them. Some people call them face cards, but when I use that word, I was immediately court cards. Okay. And as I will go through them with you, because that is actually relevant and important to know what is going on with these cards. The second category would be characters on playing pieces. And this is mostly, it seems at least so far, an East Asian tradition. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, but you can imagine that you can put text on playing pieces just to separate one from the other, even if you cannot read these particular languages. So in that case, we have pieces of language. So here there are three games. On the left, you see the game of Mahjong, and there are some pieces that have a Chinese character. And that stands for a particular word that is useful. Even if you don't speak Chinese or cannot read Chinese, you can still play Mahjong by just separating the pieces that way. In the middle is Chinese chess, where every piece has a character. And as you may know from the way we play chess here, in Western Europe and in many other parts, all our pieces are figurative pieces. We shape the things instead of put words on them. And that is a deliberate choice we have made. We don't put language on there, we put shapes, which is actually quite awkward. Try to make your own chess set, and you will not make the shapes. You will probably just put a piece of paper and start drawing something, because shaping a wooden piece is too much work. And on the right, you see a Japanese chess set, which is interesting because they actually can flip their pieces during the game. And then you will see the text on both sides. So there's both actually two colors as well. And both sides of the pieces have characters. But again, this is fairly rare. We don't have many board games where text in that way actually plays a very active role. We can, of course, concentrate on that, but then the lecture will be a little bit shorter. I will give you one more example that this is not necessarily just what we call traditional games. Some people call them non-proprietary games, but we have here a proprietary game, commercial game, a game that has a patent somewhere. Very controversial topic, because we have some commercial games that became traditional games with no longer a patent and being homemade, and the other way around. But this is a proper commercial game, and you probably know it. I don't even know. Well, some people actually know this version of it, but do you also know the German version, for instance, or the French version, or the Dutch version? Because in Holland and in Germany, it's called Stratego. And the Stratego game you can kind of figure out because there is a flag there somewhere, and that's probably the only point that you can get from this. And there's some war going on, and that is what Stratego is about. There's a war between two armies, and there's a flag that you have to conquer. And what do we do in the original French and then Dutch version that came about? We start drawing the general, and then we drawing the sergeant, instead of just writing general and sergeant, which is what we do in Chinese. That's the only difference. So the Chinese received this game through the United States, we think. That the origin story is actually quite complicated, but actually quite interesting. And what happens here is something else, and that is why I wanted to bring up this particular one. We have also an example here where there is text on the board, and that is that middle picture. So here it's on the left, and words on game boards is yet another way of dealing with language and board games. Again, not that common. We see it in the game of Stratego, and I'll go into that in a few seconds, but not in that many games do we see this. We actually see this more often in the modern games, where people start writing Monopoly on it, and they write all kinds of text on it. That is actually quite a recent thing. And most traditional games, we don't have that. Now, this is not perfectly true, so let's at least look at some details. First, let's get this Stratego game out of the way, because this doesn't necessarily look like Stratego. It has a lot of text on it, which you absolutely do not need. So none of this text is actually useful if you want to play the game. The only thing that you need to know is that these dark red squares is the two places where you can put your flag. You can only put it in one of those, which is a little bit different from how we play it in the West. Other than that, all those texts are optional. The shape of the particular square, which is sometimes a circle, is enough. And then you see a railroad, which is a brilliant invention. You should really play the Chinese version, because it's way more interesting than the German or the Dutch version, because on the railroad you can move much faster, and it creates a much more dynamic game. So I highly recommend this version of the game, but as you can see, you don't need text to understand that there is a railroad. Yeah, so all these things, the visual things, are more than enough, but we have a tradition of text and board games in the East, particularly in China and Japan and Korea. And that is why probably they also felt obliged to actually add text to the board. But they're not the only people, and it's not just recent games. We have at least one famous example where it also occurs in antiquity. But I think it's the only one, or at least it's one of very, very few. We have an occasional character in an Egyptian game that you may find. We also find them without, and that's the same with this game. This is a precursor of the game of backgammon. It's called duodecim scripta. It's this 12, 3 rows of 12 squares, as you can see here. And once in a while, they can add text to that, which is not the normal way to put text, but this is a very unusual example. This is from Ephesus, where there is Greek letters put in every square. Now, why would you do that? There's no added value in terms of gameplay. The letters don't add anything in terms of rules. There's actually no point in putting any letters in there. So this is an example that is the only example. It's a drawing of a photograph, the only fully preserved duodecim scriptum board in wood. This is from Sudan, Nubia. There is another one in Denmark, but that's it. There's no other wooden boards. It's Roman. And just strange comment that I just made. There's one in Sudan and there is one in Denmark, both outside of the Roman Empire. Those are the only 2 wooden ones we have. So there's something very curious with these games. These games travel across enemy borders. They travel across linguistic borders. So most games don't want to have anything linguistic on the board because that impedes travel. Or you would have to change the language. And we don't find this board, which is from Nubia, with some kind of Meroitic, as we saw that book, Meroitic language. That would be the language that we have to put on there with some Meroitic signs on there. No. There's only 2 types of duodecim scripta boards with any kind of text, and that is a Latin one and a Greek one. Those are the only languages that have been used, and those are the ones that are popular when you go to Rome, where apparently they don't like wooden boards, or at least they have not been preserved. And what they do is they make a board like this. Only letters, no squares, no nothing. You just put letters there. And the fun part is you can turn it into a little poem. And that's what they do. So you carve these letters with, very clearly in 2 rows of 6 or, 3 rows of 12, however you want to describe this. And you have a little poem. I made a translation in English, which is the same structure. So empire lauded, rivals beaten, Romans at play. But you also have some with a menu for the bar where it was actually being put. Yeah, so you can put it to all kinds of practice if you like. And of course, this is a very cheap way of making a board, but also kind of a fun way to make a board. What I haven't figured out is, do people then read it upside down if you're on the other side? But that seems not to be a discussion. So here we have actually words, which I said was particularly rare. You find an individual character, an individual letter, but finding words is fairly rare. So in terms of language, we're kind of limited still. We will look at some examples where even a letter can make a huge difference for us, but I was looking more, and actually Jacob's also looking more for words, something that we can actually compare, real language, so to speak. So, and that is how we get then to this idea of a lexicon. Words that are particular to a game, the name of the game, the name of the pieces, the name of the rules. And that is exactly what we want to look for then, but that takes effort. And I will just give you a number of places, examples, where I try to make that effort, which was not because there was this wonderful thing going on in Berlin. This was because I happen to be a linguist and I thought I might as well. And then 20 years later, it appears to be relevant. So, and that is how many board games researchers actually do their thing. They have always done that, and they suddenly find out there is a colloquium where people are interested in what they did. And actually say it's very important what you did, because now we can finally say something about this. Thank you for collecting it. So let's go somewhere very far away. So the Marshall Islands, I hope you've all been there. It's a wonderful place. It's atolls, which means that you have a submerged mountain and only the coral reef around it is still left. All the islands are atolls in this place, which means you have a very long road that goes along the island, but only long, you can actually walk from one side to the other. And there they play games, as they do in many places. And as you can see here on the bottom right, they seem to be playing checkers, which is a whole different story about where this game came from. I'm just going to talk about the language part. Immediately you see they don't have checker pieces, those nice round checker pieces. They use coral that you find. And then they have large and small coral pieces, which is not a very convenient way of playing. And then you can make a king in checkers. I don't know if you know the game of checkers. You can make a king when you get to the other side of the board and you put one on top of the other, which you cannot do with coral. So you just have to memorize where the kings are. Very annoying. Yeah, so there's never in board games, as far as I've seen, that it is particularly convenient that the way we're doing it. The convenience is of a different kind. The convenience sometimes is what we can find in our surroundings, sometimes because that is the way we always happen to do these things. There's no optimization in this is the best way of play. Sometimes, and sometimes it's the opposite. So we have to put away all these efficiency things that we have thought about. Anyway, where are the marshals? The marshals are somewhere there. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, it's close to the equator. And they're part of Micronesia, which means small islands, because they're mostly atolls. And what happens here, we have a game that looks like checkers. It is checkers. The variation they play is very interesting. It is known in the literature as Russian or Palestinian. There are no Russians in marshals. There are no Palestinians in the marshals. And that is more a result of our limited research on checkers. So it is way more likely that it came with American soldiers who also played that version in the south of the United States that has never been described. We know they played it, but we don't have the rules, so we cannot really compare it. That is how complicated board game studies has become. They have a lexicon. And that is the first lexicon I'm showing you. It's a lexicon with a number of words that are either loan words or words they have come up with themselves that are particular to the game. And they're not all as particular. So for instance, the word for king is just the Marshallese word for king. It's as simple as that. Now, you don't speak Marshallese, although I asked if that could be a prerequisite for the lecture, but it seems to be a problem. So nobody understands Marshallese. So there is a very limited phonetic inventory, phonemic inventory for the Marshallese language. So if you want to say checkers, you end up saying Jacob. And you go like, is that far-fetched? Not so much. Try to say checkerboard, and they say checkerboot. Ah, yeah, it is actually kind of close. So checkerboot is just the Marshallese pronunciation of checkerboard. And Jacob became the word for checkers. The word for game is keen. That also sounds like it makes sense as a loan word. And that just gives us an idea that where they got this from is from English language, not Russian, right? So not Arabic. It's English language that probably brought us here. And that is what we are trying to do with this lexicon stuff. It should just tell us a little bit about the history of what's going on, history of how they got the game, history of why they play the game, all of those. Now, one or two words seem to be very particular to the game, and one jamtiltili. They did not have another meaning for that than just to capture many pieces. So that seems to be a word that has been developed while playing the game. So a unique word, just specific to the game, which we will use as well in our research when we want to have names that are very specific, because if they are borrowed, it has to be a very specific place where they borrowed it from. Okay. I'm going to go to a second example. And there it's just about one word. We're in Sri Lanka, so suddenly we're in South Asia. And the giveaway is that you see an elephant. It's an Indian elephant. So in South Asia, which is Sri Lanka is somewhere over there. So you have Africa, that is for me much more important. So it's prominently there. And then there's South Asia, which is somewhere a little bit to the east. And what we have here is two people playing checkers. Now, this was for me a very important find, because you can see a checkerboard, but if you look carefully, you see that there are too many squares. So a French, we call it, a checkerboard has 100 squares, and a British one has 64, like a Czech chessboard. American one has usually 64. But in Holland, where I'm from, and in France, and international checkers, international draft is always played on a 10 by 10 board, 100 fields. And here, if you look carefully, it's 12 by 12. There's 144 fields. That doesn't make any sense. Well, it exists, we know that, but we don't know who came up with it. We don't know where it comes from. It doesn't seem like an obvious way of doing things. We know the strategies are not very different on the 12 by 12. They're exactly the same as the one on 10 by 10. So that was the first riddle. So I asked them, do you mind playing a game for me so I can check what the rules are? And we'll have them play. Okay, did we see that? So that is the problem with games research. You have to be so careful. I will go back. Does it do that? Does that? Yes. Okay, I'm going to play it once more. So we start here with the map. Then we have two people there with a 12 by 12 board. And they play. And pay close attention. Did you see that? That's not okay. I will do it in slow motion. So here is the guy on the left. He is moving his black piece. And here's the guy on the right, and he's getting his white piece. And here's the guy on the left also moving a black piece. And now is the guy on the right going for it, going for it. He's going for a black piece. I don't know if you ever play checkers. That's not what you're supposed to do. Yeah. So what happens, he takes the black piece off the board. And there is a very particular reason why you would ever take somebody else's black piece off the board. And that is a very particular rule, very specific. That is if they forgot to capture. It's a punishment. You forgot to capture. You're taking your piece. And it has a name. And in English, it's called huffing. It's the huffing rule in English. In Dutch, it's called blazen, blaas. And then there's this third word that does not exist for that. But you could say in English, you could say blaas, but that is not the word. The word is huff. So I asked them, what's going on? What just happened? And they said, well, you know, blaas. You said, what? Blaas. Where is this word coming from? We don't know. Maybe it means blast. But it's not what you said. No, we say blaas. So they had no knowledge of where the word was coming from, but this was clearly a Dutch word. Nothing to do with huff. Yeah, so for the first time, I actually was able to say, look, they're playing a 12 by 12 checkerboard in a country where a very specific rule in the game has a Dutch name. There is a likelihood that the Dutch had something to do with it. By just one word. It's too specific, too much. Okay, is this the only Dutch thing that we find in Sri Lanka? No, not at all. Does it solve the riddle of the 12 by 12 board? No. I don't know if you know about 12 by 12 checkerboards. They are in Sri Lanka, they're in Malaysia, they're in Canada, and they're in Antigua. If you find any historical connection between the four, I congratulate you, I have not found any. It seems to be that this game was distributed and then the in-between places were lost. It's not found in Holland anymore. I found one in the United States, but not played anymore. So there's something, it is losing ground, so to speak. What is the other thing that we still have in Sri Lanka that is Dutch? Well, the Dutch were there, so that kind of helps at some point. In the 1600s, there was a Dutch presence until the British took over and occupied it. So we know there was a Dutch presence, so historically it kind of makes sense that they could have introduced games, and they did another game. They have another game that is especially popular, and it's called 304. And 304 is, any person from Sri Lanka will tell you that they either know the game or they actually play the game. Interestingly, when they tell you that, they will also tell you it's a unique game. Because this is the most bizarre thing in this game that you don't see in any other game. The highest card is the jack. And the second highest card is the 9. So really, Sinhalese uniqueness. And if you're from Switzerland or Western Germany or from Holland, you go like, yeah, we have that game. It's called Jas. All the Jas games are very particularly have this order of cards, and that is how you recognize them. And in Dutch, it's called klaverjas. So that makes total sense. The Dutch brought perhaps this card game as well. And a little bit of extra evidence was that the word klaver, which means clubs, the suit of clubs, is actually still a word in Sinhalese. Not the other ones, not diamonds, not hearts, not spades, only clubs. The Dutch word for clubs is still found there. So yet another hint that we have language that gives us a little bit of a evidence that the Dutch may have been instrumental in the distribution of certain games in the area. All right. I'm just checking how many people fell asleep, but it is okay so far. I may fall asleep. I have a jet lag, and it's around this time. So if I nod off, just let me know. The card games can bring us much more, I would say, complicated, much more involved stories. This is by far the most surprising story I encountered in Rwanda. And Rwanda is famous for the gorillas. That is why many tourists go there to see the gorillas up close. They play checkers, as you can see on the right, on a 10 by 10 board, as we expect. It's a very hilly country when you want to see the gorillas, but you can ask for games, and that's what I did. So if you want to know exactly where it is, and it's quite important, it's a landlocked country in Africa. Central, not at the sea at all, in a mountainous area. So, it's a former Belgian colony, infamously, I would say, because of the Hutu and Tutsi disaster that occurred there, where the Belgians had some responsibility at least. And it later made itself a British Commonwealth, which was in the 2009s or something. This is fairly recent. And that is their historical, their colonial background. And that is important because we just said, okay, there were some Dutch people in Sri Lanka and there were British people. That helps us to see, okay, who do we expect to give games that we otherwise find in Europe as well. Just that kind of connection. Now, what do we find? We find card games. I asked, do you play cards? Oh yeah, we play card games. It's called Amaturufu. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Turuf is Trumpf in German, Trump in, sorry, didn't want to mention that word, but in English. But it's multiple things that go, okay, that makes sense. That's already kind of an indication. And then there is Ibigurasha, but that's just a children's game. And they only use these cards. The ace of 7, the king, the jack, the queen, the 6, the 5, and the 4, and with the remainder of the cards have this children's game that they play. And I said, do you play any other games? No. Well, that's weird. Because the whole idea of a deck of cards is that you can play multiple games with it. That's the fun of it. That's the point. No, this is the only game they play. Okay. And this is the order of the cards. They say yes. Okay, ace, 7. Okay, that must be something specific. And then king, jack, queen. I mean, you can do all kinds of things, but I've never seen anybody on purpose change the order of the king, the jack, and the queen. That doesn't really make any sense to anyone, I would say, until you ask card game historians, those people that we used to ignore. We actually have to ask questions now. And they tell you a different story, and I will tell you that story as well. And it's very helpful to understand what's going on here, which leads to other questions that we'll then try to attack. So first of all, we used to have, or we still have, 4 court cards, not 3. And if you're German, you may know that from the Tarot deck in Germany. If you're French, it's from the Tarot deck. If you're Italian, this idea of tarot cards that some people only know from the movies, which is a different type of thing, is a wonderful game that is a precursor to bridge. And that is how card games actually established themselves at the end of the Middle Ages. So extremely important deck, the tarot deck, that's where everything got involved, but it had a lot of cards. And 4 court cards became, in almost any deck, 3 court cards. That was a little bit easier to print because it fit on one sheet, or whatever reason they found to actually lower the number of court cards. And that is important for us. Now, first of all, let me explain what the court cards are supposed to be. We have a king. I have the French version here, so the roi. The chevalier, the knight, if you like. Dame, the lady. And the valet, who parks your car in the United States, but here it's actually a card. So in this order, and these are the names in French. And of course, if depending on what your language is, you have different words for these cards. And you may miss one, because you probably have only words for 3 of the cards, and not for 4. Yeah, everybody with me? Because now I'm going to teach. So, the French, in their deck, got rid of the chevalier. It is no longer there. And the French deck is kind of important because that also became the American deck, it became the Dutch deck, it became a deck that is probably the most international deck of cards that we have. And it had only a king, a queen, if you speak English, otherwise a dame, a valet, or if you're English, a jack. Those are the cards. Yeah? So that is the French way of getting rid of something. You do away with the guy on the horse. Now, this already leads to all kinds of linguistic curiosities. I put this down here because I just realized that we only have this letter on there. Now, the letter on cards is a fairly recent invention. So we didn't put anything on the corner of the cards until about the 1900s. So, but bear with me. It is still interesting that we do that because it helps us. Like you don't have to open the card entirely. You can just look at the corner. But it immediately leads to confusion because, as you can see, in French it is RDV and in Dutch it is HVB. So depending on what language your card game is in, the V is either a jack or a queen. So are these letters that helpful? Well, yes and no, depending on what language you speak. You all have to learn this before you can actually move forward. There was just an aside, but complexity is what it is all about. So, second version, not French, it's the Spanish, German, Austrian, Swiss version. We get rid of the lady. I don't know if that is specific for German-speaking, Spanish-speaking people to get rid of the lady, but that is what you have done. And you have to live with it. And what happens now is that you can see that there is clearly a knight in the Spanish deck. And there is, in the Swiss deck, even people that write it out as a word, which seems to be a Swiss thing. So for the modern Swiss game, you still see it. There are some German decks that also do it, but they're not very common. A König, an Ober, and an Under. Okay, so 3 men. As you see on the left, 3 men. And we can clearly see that that has come from the tarot deck. Not very complicated, I hope, but also interesting that we now also have full words in there. The only deck where we actually see that once in a while is actually in this German-Swiss deck. So, do we have any other options? Got rid of the chevalier, we got rid of the queen. So, who gets rid of something else? Well, the Portuguese. They're very far away in Europe. That's just a corner. They seem to be doing their own thing. And they decided to do away with the jack. And now perhaps you can solve the puzzle. Because if you do away with the jack and you're using a French deck of cards, then yeah, the queen has to come third and the man has to become second. So the jack is suddenly now promoted to becoming a knight. And then the queen is now the third one. Yes, so we have clear. No other question can be asked here. This has to be Portuguese. Nobody else would even think of this. This is a Portuguese background that we have. Well, solved that puzzle. Created another one. This is where Rwanda is, and where is Portugal. There are no Portuguese in Rwanda. They don't speak Belgian, they don't like Belgians. Belgians and the Portuguese have nothing together. Rwanda still has nothing with the Portuguese. There is no Portuguese in Rwanda. So why do you play a very essential, very clearly, in many ways, even when you look at the rules, everything is Portuguese about this game. Where are the Portuguese? The Portuguese are, oh, sorry, too fast, are, does it want to go back? Yes. They're on the coast. They're all over the coast of Africa, very clearly. And on the coast of, for instance, Tanzania, you will find Portuguese card games. They're very well established. That is where the Portuguese introduced to. Which means that that Portuguese card game came all the way from the coast, not brought by the Portuguese, but brought through the Swahili slave trade. That goes all the way to Rwanda. That explains a number of things, because that also explains why we only have one card game that they play. They were not introduced to card games, they were introduced by traders, this one game that they played, instead of by people who resided there, who played all kinds of card games, and they picked up a few. Yeah, very different way of actually transmitting the game from one place to another, entirely based on the order of the cards. It's an interesting place to do research, because they also have mancala games, as you see on the right. That is those games with rows of holes and counters that you spread around. In this case, it's a 4-row mancala game that you don't see in Europe and the United States. And they play checkers on a 10x10 board. And that makes sense, because jeu de dame, or dame as they call it, is clearly an introduction, possibly by the Belgians. And the mancala board is clearly an introduction, or an introduction. It's a similar game to what we find in East Africa. So that's another link that we have with the coast, for instance, of Tanzania, where they also play 4-row mancala games that are particular just to East Africa. We don't find them like this anywhere else. So the games now give us an interesting and a complex picture of where everything has been, but also what influences have come to the country, which in this case is now no Portuguese presence, of course. Former Belgian colony, which explains a little bit. A French game, but that may have been Belgian. And a mancala game that is clearly from the Swahili coast. There is more language to it. So we can, before we actually conclude on this one, we can look at the language part that confirms basically what we now inferred from the order of the cards. So there is names for the queen and a jack and a king, and they are Swahili names, Wapiri, Watatu, Wayin, which basically means sets of 2, or 2, 3, and 4. So there is no reference to the fact that there are men and women. There's no reference to anything. It's just the value of the cards. And the only person that comes in is the ace, which is called Bwana. And Bwana means master or sir. That is the only one, the big guy, the big card. So this kind of a separation of what we think of, but we consider a king is the most powerful. They took that away and just gave it a number. And in many other card games in that region, you find out that they're just called Wazungu, white people, without any kind of further distinction between them. Seti is 7, and that's interesting because that is a Portuguese word. Unfortunately, that Portuguese word for 7 is found all over East Africa, so it happens to be a loan word that is more broadly, not necessarily just for card games. And then the joker is a joker, just as in French, which probably was also used in several other places at that time. Not particularly surprising. So in conclusion, what we have now, we have a French jeu de dame game that came through probably the Belgians. We have a mancala game that came from the Swahili coast, and we have a card game that came from the Swahili coast. Yeah, so just order of the cards, language, we kind of cobble together the history of games in this region through these references that we got. Okay, there's more we can do. So let's go a little bit further south. And what happens is that if you do card games or board games, you go somewhere, you find the game that you're looking for perhaps, and then you ask, do you play other games? And that's an important thing to do. That is what I ended up doing. I do board games research, but I should ask about the card games since I'm there. And nobody else is there or is going to go there just for the cards. So I should. And then you will come up with some surprises once in a while. And that is how this research actually was formed. You see here groups of people playing cards. I will tell you what happened there. So first of all, who are these people and where are we? We are here in Botswana. Botswana is not a densely populated country. And we're here in the Kalahari Desert, which is even less densely populated. And the people that are there are called the Jungma. And the Jungma are famous because they are what we call part of the San, or some people call them Bushmen. They sometimes call themselves Bushmen. Famous for their way of life, have been researched forever. And it was a former British colony, so let me get that out of the way. What do we expect? We expect card games in particular to come through European channels. Mancala games, not so much, but card games very much. Interestingly, we already had an example where that was not the case. It came through the Swahili slave trade. Yeah. So the people are Jungma speakers. That means they have a lot of clicks in their language. I was there for both linguistic research and for games research. And actually the game I was researching was what we call a gesture game, hand gesture game. Kind of a rock, paper, scissors game, but set to music and actually has its own complexity. And they demonstrate that, and it's fascinating to watch. But I asked, do you play cards? Actually, I didn't have to ask, because they were playing cards. Just, to pass the time, they played cards. And then I did the linguistic thing. I said, okay, tell me the names of all your cards. And tell me the names of your games. And they said, well, we play a game, and I'll go straight to that one first, because that took me by surprise. We have this game called Chris 80. And I thought, Chris 80? Never heard of Chris. Chris 80 sounds very British language type, but it's not Jungma, I can tell you that. But which card game is that? So you have to ask a card game historian. He said, oh, yeah, Crazy Eights. Okay, thank you. Figured out that one. I would have to go to huge lists to actually figure that out, but it is obvious names that come from the English language. Take Two, they use the same game name as we have in English, Crazy Eights. Penalty is a shootout type of game. All makes sense. And then we get some curious words in there. They have some words from Setswana. Setswana is the official language of Botswana. So that is the official language used also in government. English and Setswana is very broadly used. So we see that karatasi is probably a loan word also in Setswana, but that is the word they use themselves for card game. And then there's a word for diamonds, and they use also the Setswana word for that. Now, why is this interesting? You see that some words are English, some words are Setswana, and some words are Jungma. And if you have Jungma words, what words are those, and why only those? And you see that slowly they are developing their own vocabulary for the game. And this is in flux. We find them midway. This is a fairly recent introduction. They use some words from Setswana because they learned it from people who actually spoke Setswana with them. And then now they're adapting and adopting the game. And you can see, if you look at what they then come up with, card game, Hanushi, well, okay, papers. Okay, that makes kind of sense. Clubs, chicken feet. Very original, easy to remember as well. Actually, I find it a more fun word than clubs. Buttocks for the spades. And cowhard, specifically cowhard, not just hard, but cowhard. And those words are interesting in multiple ways, and I can show you why it is still in flux. And this is just a snippet from the article that came out on this. At the bottom, you see these terms are interspersed with English and even back translation. A back translation. It means that, okay, we have the word for clubs, that is the English word. Then we have the word for clubs in Jungma, which is orokokokasi. Okay. And then what do they say? They sometimes say chicken six. They translated their own word for clubs back into English and only used part of it actually, and said chicken six to refer to the six of clubs. And you see there is this there is a movement going. There's some development. It has not been settled yet what the word is going to be. We found them midway of the development of the language for the cards. When I go back there in 10 or 15 years, this is clearly likely to have changed by then. Yeah. Now, do they play other games? Yes. Mancala games. So this is the type of game that you will find in Botswana and Namibia, so the southwest of African continent. And these are these huge games of 4 rows, up to 32 holes per row. Depending on the size, you play a half a day or you play an hour. And you can actually adopt the size if you like. And you can see them playing on the right. And they have their own word for that. And I put them there because we will actually briefly talk about that a little later on. So they have other influences going on that are also game related. So if we now have the Junta here, we have British who introduced cards to Botswana, not so much to the Junta. Then there's contact between all these groups, and they're adopting games like Owela, that was the game that you saw, the big Mancala game, and cards with English and Setswana terminology. And then you see that they are developing their own terminology, particularly for the card games, which is rather rich in language compared to board games. All right. I have no idea how long I have been talking, but let me talk a little bit more. We have game names that can also help us. And that is actually the part where most linguists tried to find something. And that is also the part that has delivered the least amount of interest. So when we develop research where we actually collect an entire lexicon, we have much more chances of actually finding something of interest than just looking for the name of the game. You may, for instance, wonder, okay, what is the name for King, Jack, and Queen in Junta? I did not mention that because it was J, Q, and K. Yeah, so if I just was looking at the name for the court cards, because that was so interesting in that other language, then I'm missing the point. You should collect everything and then you will find where is the material of interest. And that it can be quite diverse. So game names, I will go through those because it is still interesting, but also a notable point, particularly for Mancala games where this has been tried, that this game, for instance, has all these different names, Owela, Queen, Poes, and Tui. They are clicks, as you can see. So they actually have developed their own name for the game. So it's very clearly a Junta name or a Nama name, but they're not related. I cannot say, okay, this must clearly have come from English or from Setswana or from the neighbors. They actually created their own name. Now, if we go to a different game, as it displayed in South and Southeast Asia, this is a photograph of two ladies playing it in the Maldives. We have Chonka and Sunka. Yes, they are cognates. So they give some idea that these games may be related. But Dakon and Ovalu are unrelated. So we have only an occasional relationship between them. And this is perhaps the most telling. This game is 2 rows of 6. This is the game that some of you may actually be familiar with, or it looks like the one you're familiar with. The rules are slightly different. And we have the name Wari and Wari. Wari is the name that is used in the Caribbean. And clearly the West African and the Caribbean words are related. And not only related, it's actually where it came from. So they brought the name of the game with them. And there are many names like that for Mancala games. Oware, Wela, Owela, and you see the W and the LR sound coming back every single time. But the only exception perhaps for Ayo, which is from Nigeria. But Owela was just the game that we looked at. That was that huge game from Namibia. So now we have names, yes, they are linguistically all related, but they're not referring to the same game. They're actually referring to some strikingly different games. And that we actually don't know what games they refer to, except that probably a Mancala game. We can take that a step further, and soon we'll get an example where you can even go outside of games, or board games, I would say. So a final example, the game of Bao, played in Zanzibar, but also played on the East African coast. 4 rows, always 4 rows, 4 rows of 8, never any other configuration. Known as solo, Igi solo, as we saw in Rwanda, that one 4-row game. So there seems to be something going on, except for the word bao, which is actually the dominant word for it. And the word so is used for the seeds by the people who say the word bao. So the word for the seeds has taken on the word for the game in some places, and in other places it's the word for the seeds. But then you have to collect the name for the seeds as well to figure that one out. So let's talk about bao a little bit. I wrote a book on it, so I can talk forever on the game of bao, which I will try not to do. So bao, a mancala game, has a lexicon. And the reason why this lexicon is, I saved that for last, is so pronounced, is that it is played at a tournament level. So these people don't just play, they play in clubs competitively. And if you do that, then other words come in. There are words for strategy suddenly that are becoming important. And there is a whole network of people that always play together because it is a club thing, not a family thing. So you can actually develop words that everybody uses because you're in continuous contact. In my household, with my parents, we had certain words for certain games and certain plays, but it was only in our household. Yeah. So this is the list that I have for that. And you can see there's a long list, but the first word is already what I find very curious. The word bao means board. That is the translation of it in regular speech. And it is the word that also has now become the word for the game. And because the game is so well known, it has become the word for a goal in soccer. Yeah, so when you say 2-0, it's Mabama really, okay, fine. So, but that is interesting. The word now transfers to another game, which is not even a board game. The word mtaji. Mtaji is very specific for the game of Bao. It's a second part of the game. It's a place where you start to make a move. It has a lot of very particular connotations, but it also means something to start a business with, the capital to start a business with, which kind of makes sense that you use that word also for a place where you start your particular move. And I'm going through these because I will show you a poem in a few seconds where that actually is being used by the poet to play with these words. Takasa means to cleanse or to clean. Takasiya means to cleanse. And Takasi is to cleanse somebody. Very particular, only used in the game. Namua is the first stage of the game. Just Namu means to take a turn. And then we get the strategies. Bana bao, squeezing bao. Later on, tapisha bao, vomit bao. Kitakimbi means attacking the kimi, which is a name for a specific hole. Kitakomwe means attacking the big one, but also means hiding a little seed in your hand when you're playing, like in cheating. Also the word for an opening play. It's one specific one. You're playing kitakomwe, you're playing that particular opening. It has a name, it's called kitakomwe. So multiple words, multiple meanings for the same word, all very specific to the particular game. Pika tanji, pika just means to hit. And pika tanji attack several things, very specific for the game, again. Utitiri is perhaps the funniest one, that is, you have single seeds in a row, and it means chicken lice. A very particular adoption of a non-game word into the game. Now, many of these are not particularly useful to see, okay, let's compare 5 other languages and see what their game lexicon is, because there are very few languages that actually have a game lexicon that big, unless they play it competitively. And all the people that play Bao competitively are Swahili speakers. So it's likely that you only get Swahili words, so the same words, so it's not going to be helpful in that sense. But it is helpful in other ways. So here is a poem from beginning of the 19th century, I would say the 1820s. one of the most famous poets of Swahili, Muyaka bin Haji. And Muyaka bin Haji wrote over 150 poems. Actually, he did not write anything. He would sing them, or he would recite them. There was oral. And in very specifically, in 1895, somebody decided to write them down from memory. Muyaka bin Haji had been dead since 1840. And they did that in what is, we call it Swahili Arabic script. So if you read Arabic, you will be a little bit confused because nothing Arabic comes out, it's all Swahili. They also came up with a few new signs in there. And in Swahili Arabic script, we can find a poem that is about the game of Bao, which is very, very rare to find sources that old that actually talk about the game. The only times that we actually find that in the literature is usually in poetry, because poetry is usually the oldest written stuff that we find. And that's actually what I've been working on with Jacob in the last few days, which is verses, again, although not high-level poetry, but still verses in Sanskrit. And what we find here is that the poet knows the game. And how do we know this? He uses these words that are specific to Bao. The word mtaji, the word nam, the word takata, are all words that only Bao players use, but he uses them in a way so that if you don't know how to play Bao, you can still understand the poem, but you don't understand the joke. So he uses the mtaji word only in the second stanza, because it's the second part of the game. And he uses takata clearly as it should be used, and it's used actually as a Bao player would use it, but namu he uses in multiple ways. So this entire poem is actually an indication that somebody knows the game and then start writing poetry. And if you both know the game and you know Swahili, you will get the joke. You will get the allusions. You will get all the parts that are related to it. Okay. That is what I had prepared for you. Just a number of snippets from different parts of research where we actually also collect the words and the sentences sometimes, the vocabulary, the lexicon of the ludic world. So this is where I will end, but not necessarily, because you can ask multiple questions. Much of this is also published, so if you would like to read and see what is actually out there, then you're welcome to that too.